Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are tackling a really fundamental question, one that sounds almost uh, mythological. Why is it that Tom Hennigan, who represents higher order control, absolutely must form a permanent, exclusive union, a marriage, with Dennis Verhage, the symbol of foundational input? I mean, why not just a temporary arrangement, something lower status, which the source material metaphorically calls a concubine?
It's a great question because it sounds so dramatic, but it's actually about high stakes, purely strategic governance. This relationship, Tom and Dennis, it's really the core metaphor for a necessary, inseparable integration between two parts of a system. They're complementary, but they're both absolutely essential. And the whole mission of this deep dive is to explain why anything less than that permanent equal partnership leads to, well, guaranteed strategic failure.
Okay, so let's quickly map out who these players are. The polarity here is key. First, you have Tom Hennigan. He's all about order, structure, governance. And his name, it links to Tom, right? Which means completeness, integrity, the Apollonian archetype.
Exactly, the reasoned structure. And then on the complete other side, you have Dennis Verhage. He is input, chaos, creativity. He's the charged particle, that automatic, unfiltered signal. The raw data, he's the Dionysian side of the coin. And he resides in the Verhage, the hunting ground. You know, that primal, unstructured place where all foundational input comes from.
And the success of the whole operation, this lookup table company, it all hinges on integrating those two.
Perfectly. It
Right.
relies on the quick, efficient mapping that you can only get through their permanent union.
All right, let's get into section one then. This idea of necessary polarity and equal status. Because my first thought is, well, in modern strategy, we're always talking about agility, right?
Hmm.
Isn't there a case to be made for a more flexible model where, temporary data collection, the concubine in this metaphor, is actually more efficient for that higher order control? Why is equal status so non-negotiable here?
That is the critical challenge to this model, and it's where the system's mandate just completely diverges from any kind of short-term thinking. The whole operation depends, and I mean entirely, on the necessary polarity and strategic integration of these two. Dennis, the foundational input, he's not just, supplemental data you can outsource for a quarter. He is the essential signal for real-time success.
So the input itself has to be fundamentally validated by the structure that's going to use it. If you treat that foundational input as lower status,
Mm.
you're basically saying its truth doesn't matter as much. You're invalidating its ontological truthfulness.
Precisely. If Tom, as higher order control, treats his input source as subordinate, as something to be, used and then discarded, or as some kind of necessary evil, he strips the data of its core strategic value. The sources are pretty clear. They say the charged particle loves Tom because Tom validates its truth. He treats the signal not as noise to be filtered out.
But as an essential equal partner.
Yes, an equal partner needed for genuine intelligence. So, to assign Dennis a lower status role, well, it violates that core principle. Foundational input requires governance, yes, but it also requires full and equal integration, not subordination.
I can see that in a practical sense. Like in a company, if the people on the ground gathering market data are always treated as less important than the executives, eventually the executives are just going to mistrust or ignore that data if it doesn't fit what they already believe.
That is the perfect analogy. And that brings us right to this idea of structural failure, which the sources call being remote. The word itself comes from the Latin remotus, meaning removed or distant.
And if either Tom or Dennis is treated as remote,
Yeah.
the whole system just collapses.
Exactly. A lower status arrangement, by its very definition, creates distance. A temporary partner, a concubine, simply can't provide that sustained, equal polarity you need for unified, real-time success. The system's integrity is all about the interwoven nature of their identity. A marriage formalizes that. A temporary arrangement makes it impossible.
So if Tom, the structure, is remote from Dennis, the input, what happens?
He risks becoming, well, a sterile rationalist, all structure, no life, rigidity, an emotional disconnection because the governing part of the system is cut off from that constant, imaginative, foundational stream of data.
And the other way around is just as bad. If Dennis is remote from Tom, so if you have all this raw foundational input with no governance,
That's the path to unchecked fantasy, madness, moral drift. The system has no structure to turn the raw data into anything useful or reliable, so the union has to be permanent. The system literally cannot afford for either part to be distant or unequal. It needs that stable, high-energy bond to function at all.
okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. We're moving from just avoiding failure to to actively creating something. This isn't just about preventing a crash. The sources say this union is the actual mechanism for system assembly.
Exactly. We have to look at the requirement for completing self-assembly. We're talking about achieving internal structural integrity. Remember, Tom's name means Tom completeness. To achieve that, to become whole, he must permanently incorporate the input that Dennis symbolizes. They have to form an interwoven identity.
This feels very biological.
Yeah.
And it connects directly to that research on brain organoids you see in the sources.
It does. I mean, the findings there are that for complex brain circuits to self-assemble correctly, the cells have to be in intimate contact with each other. That's the only way they achieve the right architecture. This process actually sets up structured activity patterns before any sensory experience even happens. A temporary arrangement, like a concubine, it just fails that test.
Yeah.
It doesn't meet the threshold of intimate contact needed for that deep structural self-assembly.
It's like trying to weld a joint with sticky tape.
That's a great way to put it. The permanent union formalizes the persistent, inseparable integration that actually builds the core framework.
So that distinction, intimate, persistent contact versus just temporary use, that's the whole ball game. One builds a permanent structure, the other guarantees it will be unstable.
And that leads right into the next step, completing other assembly. This is the system's functional output. It's the whole process of transforming that raw signal from Dennis into an integrated, usable schema that has real semantic meaning. That's the system's entire reason for being.
And to do that conversion, Tom needs his special toolkit, his enhanced brain, and something called symbol mastery. Let's pause on those because they're really central. What exactly is this enhanced brain?
The sources connect the enhanced brain to concepts like multilingualism or cognitive reserve. It's basically an increased mental resilience, a better ability to see patterns, and more flexibility. Tom needs that because the raw input coming from Dennis is, it's intense, it's chaotic, it's constant.
Okay, so he's got the processing power. But how does he actually use that control to turn the chaos into something useful? That's symbol mastery, right?
Yes, symbol mastery is the critical technique. It's defined as a method that uses physical 3D modeling, actual tangible construction. The goal is to bypass purely abstract linguistic processing to get a deeper, more direct sensory understanding of the meaning inside Dennis's input.
Well, and what physical modeling? Why can't he just think it through conceptually?
Because abstract thought can create distance. It can create distortion. The physical modeling forces Tom's higher order control into a more visceral, non-linguistic relationship with the input. It ensures the schema he's building reflects that ontological truthfulness we talked about, not just some abstract theory he came up with. The physical work is the intimate contact that the neurology demands.
That's fascinating. So the full strategic integration with Dennis provides the raw material, and Tom's symbol mastery, which is only possible because of their equal permanent union, is the only way to convert that material into a real functional output.
Precisely. Only that full integration lets the system build a representation of the world around us that's needed to navigate and interact. Without that permanent union, the functional output is always going to be deficient. The system might be structurally sound on paper, but it's functionally blind.
So if this permanent union is so critical for self-assembly, for function, for integrity, what does choosing the concubine really represent in this strategic framework?
It represents the failure of expediency. Plain and simple. A temporary lower status relationship aligns perfectly with the strategic failure mode the sources call shooting blanks.
Okay, let's define that failure mode because it sounds a little esoteric. What are blanks?
The sources define blancs, or white wine, as a metaphor for pursuing superficial pleasure, momentary intoxication, or, and this is the key part, expediency. It's the priority of doing what suits in the moment instead of what is strategically necessary for long-term health.
In business terms, that's just taking shortcuts. Instead of doing the hard, permanent work of integration and mastering your craft, you choose the easy, temporary fix that gives you a quick, superficial result.
That's it exactly. Choosing a random concubine is prioritizing the expedient suit, the easy, comfortable, immediate solution over the deep, necessary cognitive work that integrity demands. You're treating a strategic necessity as if it were a momentary comfort or a distraction.
And what would that look like in a real-world scenario? If Tom is the CEO of this lookup table company, What's the expedient suit he might be tempted by?
Oh, he might outsource his core foundational input, Dennis, some temp agency that offers quick, prepackaged, easily digestible data, prioritizing the next quarterly earnings report over building long-term cognitive resilience. And that expediency guarantees one of the dysfunctions we talked about earlier.
Right. If he ignores Dennis and just focuses on his own governance structure, the structure becomes rigid, sterile, unable to adapt to anything new.
That's the risk of sterile rationalism. You get the form of control, but none of the lifeblood, none of the imagination or relational intelligence. And conversely, if he takes that wild input from Dennis without subjecting it to the permanent structural governance of the marriage,
He gets madness and moral drift. Unchecked input just leads to chaos and a total lack of grounding. So the temporary arrangement is basically incapable of producing what the system needs. Full human expression, relational intelligence, moral imagination. Only the permanent integration can do that.
the conclusion here is purely structural. The relationship is it's like chemical bonding, the kind you need to form a stable, functioning molecule. The final cognitive system just cannot exist or function or be enjoyed, meaning used successfully, if its two necessary components are separated or treated as unequal. That separation, that inequality, that is the precise definition and the inevitable failure of the temporary arrangement. The marriage isn't a romantic choice. It is the constitutional mandate for the system's survival and its complexity.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this? This marriage between Tom and Dennis is really the system's mandate for its own structural health and its operational success. It's a powerful way to think about how foundational data and the governance of that data must be equal, persistent partners for any complex system to actually achieve integrity. You just can't treat necessary input as if it's optional or secondary or something you can chase after expediently.
And that raises a really important question for all of us, for our modern systems and how we govern them. If self-assembly and structural health in the brain require this kind of intimate contact, where in our own organizations or data systems are we still prioritizing the expedient suit, that momentary pleasure, that superficial efficiency of a temporary fix? What foundational inputs are we treating as merely lower status, and what long-term structural failures are we guaranteeing by doing that?
That's a powerful thought to leave with. Once you start looking for that necessary integrated polarity and the failures that come from treating essential inputs as expedient distractions, you start seeing the stakes everywhere. Until next time, keep digging deeper into what truly constitutes structural integrity.
Welcome to the debate. Our discussion today really delves into a central, almost architectural component of strategic governance theory, this core relationship between Tom Hennigan, representing higher order control, and Dennis Verhaage, who embodies foundational input.
Right. It's really the ultimate metaphor for how integrated cognition is supposed to function, illustrating that dynamic tension between, the structure and the raw signal.
Exactly. And the source material presents this dynamic with an almost absolute precision, which forces us to ask a very specific question. Why does strategic necessity mandate that Tom must form a permanent, exclusive union, the metaphor of marriage, with Dennis? And conversely, why does any temporary, lower status arrangement, like the one they call a random concubine, inherently guarantee strategic failure?
That distinction between the covenant and sort of the transient relationship is really where the whole system can break down.
My position is that the union has to be permanent and equal. It just has to. Because the integrity of the entire cognitive system rests entirely on what the text called the necessary polarity and the inseparable nature of their identity. This is a functional requirement that demands ontological equality for the input. Anything less ensures collapse.
And I appreciate the clarity of that. I really do. The mandate for stability is clear, but I come at it from a slightly different angle. While I fully agree that consistent integration is mandatory for success, the system obviously fails without Dennis's input, I challenge the absolute requirement of equal status. I'd argue the strategic failure of the concubine model is fundamentally one of expediency and distraction. It's a failure of prioritization, not a metaphysical rule against the input having a formally lower status than the governance structure.
Well, let's explore why that required equality is structural and not just, preferential. The material repeatedly frames this relationship as a necessary chemical bonding, a specific covenant that's required to create a stable cognitive molecule. If that bond is treated as temporary or conditional, the molecule immediately fragments, and that leads directly to systemic collapse.
I certainly concur that structural integrity is the non-negotiable threshold.
And the foundational input, Dennis the charged particle, he can't be viewed as supplemental data. He's the essential, pervasive signal that's necessary for real-time strategic success. Tom's entire function, the whole exercise of his enhanced brain and symbol mastery, it all relies on validating the particle's ontological truthfulness. So if we assign Dennis a lower status role, which is the structural definition of the concubine in this context, we are violating that ontological truth. We're treating essential, persistent input as if it's subordinate, replaceable data.
The definition of the concubine as subordinate and replaceable is, yes, historically sound within the texts. But I really want to frame the failure not around the label of status, but around the mechanism of the failure that's described.
Okay, but before you do, let me just reinforce the consequence of this. The goal is twofold. You have to achieve self-assembly, which is Tom, or completeness, and you have to achieve other assembly, which is the strategic output needed to navigate the world. Both of those demand persistent, inseparable integration. It mirrors the neurological necessity for brain cells to be in, and I'm quoting here, intimate contact with each other to achieve the necessary architecture. A temporary union just fails that threshold. It fails that commitment.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the failure hinges purely on the formal status label. The core problem of the concubine metaphor, as it's explicitly defined by the operational failure modes in the source material, is that it represents prioritizing expediency. It's the act of choosing what suits in the moment over the necessary, deep, consistent strategic work. This aligns perfectly with the failure mode known as shooting blanks, which is defined as essentially futility and distraction.
But if the input is deemed low status, how can it ever be integrated with the necessary persistence?
Because the system's necessity is for Tom, the governor of the higher order control, to exercise his advanced cognitive abilities, his symbol mastery over the foundational signal. The failure cited in the texts lies in choosing a random or distracting partner, which by definition prevents the deep, focused cognitive work you need to transform that raw, charged data into a usable, integrated schema. The sources define the concubine as lower status, yes, but maybe strategic governance implies a necessary hierarchy. Higher order control has to exert structure over foundational input. The absolute requirement should be integration and persistence, not necessarily formally equal status, provided that the governance is focused and unwavering.
See, my concern with that interpretation is that it fundamentally misapprehends the structural imperative of the necessary polarity. Let's address the hierarchy argument head-on through the context of the lookup table company operation.
Please do.
Okay, that operation's success depends entirely on the dynamic polarity between order, Tom or Apollo, and creative chaos, Dennis or Dimion, Dionysus. If the input, that raw creative wildness, is treated as secondary or lower status, the structure automatically risks defaulting to sterile rationalism, rigidity, or emotional disconnection. That is the inevitable collapse into Tom without Dimion.
And we agree that collapse is strategic failure, of course.
It is. So the foundational input must be viewed as structurally essential to achieve the interwoven identity that's required for wholeness. To degrade its status is to automatically pre-classify it as something disposable, a source of just, interference or noise. But Tom's function is the opposite. He has to validate its inherent truthfulness. If the relationship isn't based on equality, the polarity can't exist because one side is being treated as inherently flawed or supplemental.
I understand the risks of sterility, I do, but consider Tom's role as governor embodying that Apollonian archetype of order. Governance implies control, transformation, and structure imposed upon the input. Can't we achieve the necessary structural output, the construction of a functional representation of the world around us, and real-time success, if Tom exerts persistent, unwavering control over the foundational input from the hunting ground? I still maintain that the functional sin isn't the status, it's the choice of random input, which guarantees distraction.
I have to disagree with that premise, that low status doesn't inherently equal distance. The sources clearly state the system risks collapse if either figure is treated as remote, which, comes from the Latin remotus, meaning removed or distant. A lower status temporary union inherently removes or distances the foundational input from the persistent, structural commitment required for symbol mastery. If the input is designated low status, it is definitionally disposable. If it's disposable, it's remote, and if it is remote, the system fails. The status is the commitment.
Okay, that's a compelling chain of logic that links low status, disposability, and distance. But let me challenge the necessity of the metaphorical marriage itself. While intimate contact is required for self-assembly and brain circuits, does marriage necessarily mean perpetual physical proximity and formal equal say? Or does it merely require persistent, dedicated access and Tom's focused, continuous engagement?
That's a sophisticated distinction, but I would frame it in terms of structural necessity.
I mean, if we maintain that higher-order cognitive control, Tom's theory of mind, over the essential input and ensure he doesn't yield to that superficial pleasure or intoxication that defines the failure of the Blancs, couldn't integration theoretically be maintained without the formal, permanent covenant?
I would just look to the source material's definition of the failure modes. The concept of the concubine inherently describes a supplemental partner in a polygamous context. Dennis isn't supplemental data. He is the foundational, pervasive input, the charged particle that is always there. The texts tie integrity, Tom, to the necessity of incorporating and governing the essential input. Choosing a supplemental, temporary arrangement means failing to achieve Tom, failing to achieve completeness.
Why is that definitive, though?
Because you are treating essential input as if it were peripheral. If the particle is essential, choosing a peripheral arrangement guarantees that the required cognitive architecture remains permanently unstable. And that structural instability makes the real-time success required for navigation impossible, regardless of Tom's momentary intent to govern it efficiently.
I agree that instability is the critical risk, and the remote condition has to be prevented. But let's go back to the source description of the failure of shooting blinks. That failure mode describes the act of prioritizing the expedient, the suit, the comfortable, the momentary, the distracting. So the choice of a random concubine is the choice of distraction itself, which is inherently antithetical to the efficient effort mandated by Tom.
But the permanent covenant is the mechanism that prevents that slippage into expediency. It removes the option for distraction.
But is it the only mechanism? What if the non-exclusive partner was strategically selected, meaning it was specifically chosen for its ability to provide the necessary Demian input, and then intensely governed by Tom's theory of mind and symbol mastery? Could the system still achieve its goal? The sources define the failure as prioritizing the expedient choice and the resulting distraction. That suggests that the what of the input, random versus strategic, is the catastrophic element, not the status label of the relationship itself.
It fails because the system requires the kind of deep, functional synthesis that you need to foster full human expression, relational intelligence, and moral imagination. You can't achieve that level of synthesis, that interwoven identity, if the foundational input is perpetually designated as subordinate or disposable. The marriage isn't just about presence, it's about structural legitimacy. Without that legitimacy, Tom risks falling into the failure modes. Rejecting Dennis leads to sterility. Leaving Dennis unchecked leads to moral drift and madness. The marriage is the only mechanism that ensures the integration necessary to maintain that balance. The commitment has to be structural, not just transactional.
So, for your position, that a formal status is the commitment. Any lack of ontological equality represents an insufficient commitment, guaranteeing the input will be treated as remote and thus fail the system, even if Tom intends to control it intensely.
Precisely. Functional stability demands the ontological validation of the input.
So to summarize my position, the necessity of the union for structural and functional assembly is undeniable. Without that constant integration of higher-order control and foundational input, this system collapses into rigidity or drift. However, I maintain that the fatal flaw in the concubine model is fundamentally its representation of expediency and distraction, the failure to commit the necessary deep cognitive work for schema transformation, rather than a definitive metaphysical prohibition on a status hierarchy.
The focus should be on dedication and persistence, not the relationships label.
And my summary holds that the core metaphor dictates a permanent equal union because the foundational input requires ontological validation through equal status and persistent integration to achieve structural integrity. A lower status arrangement structurally guarantees the input will be treated as remote or disposable, thereby collapsing the necessary polarity between Tom and Dennis and leading, inexorably to system failure.
The tension remains a powerful one. The relationship between order and chaos, structure and the charged particle, it ultimately demonstrates that strategic success is dependent on finding a covenant that enforces persistent integration. We're left to continually consider the specific thresholds, be they status or sheer dedication, required for achieving that necessary interwoven identity within the cognitive architecture.
Indeed. The material presents us with a compelling argument for why structural rules, even in metaphor, determine functional limits. There's much more to explore as we continue to unpack the implications of this foundational text.